Sorry to say this to us adults, but punishments don't really do a lot of good when it comes to helping kids with misbehaviors. Hi out there, I'm Dr. Brett Pearce, child psychologist, and I'm here to talk with you today, well, you adults for this one, about a fairly sensitive subject, which is to say the subject of using punishments or consequences for kids who are struggling with misbehaviors. I'm sorry to say, but punishments don't really do a whole lot of good, which is funny to say. It's a little provocative because it seems to be sort of everywhere in culture that us adults have this idea that when a kid is struggling, what we need to do is provide them with a consequence or a punishment in order to help them learn a lesson. And the idea is that should help them modify their behavior so that they can behave in ways that are more helpful. Now, I am certainly going to tell you that the intentions behind most of those situations are generally good as far as the adults are concerned. My intention is not for this video to come across as to, because that's the entire point, if you're paying attention. However, I gotta tell you that as a child psychologist, I am a very, very firm disbeliever, I guess is what you'd say, in the use of punishment or consequence. Now, when I say punishment or consequence, I'm talking more just kind of like conventionally out there. I'm not necessarily talking about in a strict, like, theoretical sense from perhaps the behavioral tradition, but getting into that point is a little bit beyond the scope of the video. So, I'd like to talk about 3 big reasons why punishments are not a great idea when it comes to handling misbehaviors. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is the fact that they've simply not been demonstrated to really be that effective at producing behavior change. It's not that they don't have an effect on behavior, it's just that they don't really do a great job of really producing change. So the first point is, and we'll talk more about it in just a second, not too effective. The second point is that punishments and consequences can have a lot of negative effects on the situation that we often don't really intend. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. The third issue, or the third reason I should say that I don't like punishments, are that punishments don't really teach skills. And that's a really, really, really important thing. So those are the 3 points that I'm going to make to you in just a little bit here. So before I get into those 3 points, let me just, I guess, define punishments and things a little bit more. So when I say punishments and consequences, I really am referring to them sort of in general. I'm not only referring to things that we probably would all agree that are pretty harsh and extreme, like corporal punishment, use of hitting and things like that, even if it's, like spanking. I'm also referring to things like taking privileges away, taking toys away, grounding, things like that. I'm just not a fan of any of them, although I will acknowledge that some are probably sort of better than others. So let's get into my points. Number one, punishment doesn't really improve behavior. They can sort of suppress it, but generally speaking, what we find is that when we use a lot of punishment, that kids learn more how to suppress and kind of get around things. They don't really learn how to problem solve in more of an effective way. They don't learn how to take care of feelings. It just doesn't really produce behavioral change. And I haven't looked at all of the research recently, but in general, research has very consistently failed to find that punishment is a terribly effective way to go. In fact, the use of reward consistently demonstrates itself to be a lot better than punishment. And so when we have a kid who's struggling with misbehaviors of any kind, what I always invite folks to wonder about is the effectiveness of whatever it is we're doing to try to help. And if it's not getting us where we want to go, then I invite folks to really think about, well, why do we still want to punish if it's not producing change? Does it have to do more with our own kind of frustration, our own anger, maybe some kind of, something that's being activated for us by the kids' misbehaviors, which would be totally understandable. Totally understandable. I mean, I work with kids full time who can show some high levels of misbehaviors, and they can be really, really, really challenging. So that's the first point. Punishments, they just don't really produce change in really the kind of way that we're looking for. The second point about punishments is that punishments can have some undesired consequences. Now, again, this is a bit of a delicate subject, but I just invite anyone here who's listening to this video to really think about how they would like to be treated if they were struggling with, some kind of problem. I mean, imagine how you'd like to be treated by your best friend, your spouse, your boss, something like that. Suppose that you were just in a place where you were stressed out, angry, sad, scared, and maybe you were having a hard time to showing up to work on time, whatever. Maybe you're being kind of snappy with your spouse, something like that. How would you like to be treated if you were being snappy with your spouse and your spouse said, okay, well, I'm taking away your phone for a day. Okay, well, I'm now putting in your room by yourself for the rest of the night, if that's how you're going to behave. It's not as though I'm saying that everyone around you should just sort of like smile and nod and pat you on the head. But if they were just to act, punitively towards you, give you a consequence, even if it wasn't something like, hitting or you're spanking you or something like that. The point is, there's a substantial chance that you would be ticked and you would feel resentful. It probably wouldn't really help you. And I'll do another video in terms of discussing alternatives to the use of punishment, because there's the subject of helping kids with misbehaviors is actually very complex. Very complex. There's so many factors, and we'll get into that. So punishment can tend to produce a lot of things like strain or stress on a relationship. They can produce a lot of stress. Just think of a situation where at work, maybe you had sort of a consequence levied on you, and work's a little different than, close personal relationships. But still, even if it was a really appropriate consequence, like, you were showing up late and you got written up for it, even if it was justified, it's stressful. It's really, really, really stressful. And there's other bigger implications too, particularly when you have kiddos who are struggling with emotional difficulties, like say anxiety and depression. But that's, again, a little beyond the scope of this video. So that's the second point. Punishments often produce unintended consequences. And so when you follow up with the first point, that punishments don't really produce good behavioral change, so which is to say they're just not that effective at getting us what we want. And then when you combine that with the second one, which is to say it can have unintended consequences, you could almost think of this as taking a medication that isn't producing therapeutic result, but is producing a lot of side effects, right? Like, you're taking ibuprofen for a headache. It's not relieving your headache, but it's making you feel, sick to your stomach a lot. Why would you do it then? Makes sense? Okay, so let's talk about the third point that I'm trying to make, which is that punishments don't teach skills. And in my videos, you'll hear the word skills a lot. And I can't say that word enough when it comes to helping kids with misbehaviors. Being able to kind of like say, okay, I'm doing something and it's not effective, it's having a negative impact on other people and myself. I really need to think of a different way of meeting the needs that I'm trying to meet. other than the behavior that I'm doing. For example, a kiddo who, is scared to go down into the basement and clean up the basement by themselves, which is their chore, and so they're acting out because they're scared. It's a remarkable skill, remarkable to be able to reflect on that, identify the problem, brainstorm different ways of handling it. It's an amazing skill to be able to do that. It can be pretty advanced. And punishments don't really teach skills. So one other big thing that I like to do is I like to cook. And if I were teaching a class on how to, say, make kimchi, yeah, I make my own kimchi. But if I were teaching a class on that, I certainly wouldn't say to someone, make kimchi or else I'm taking your phone away. Go. Like they still wouldn't know how. I mean, they'd have probably a dose of motivation, and they'd also probably be like, I'm actually gonna get out of here. But if they couldn't get out of the class, then they would maybe have some motivation, to learn the skill, but they still wouldn't learn the skill. I would have to teach them the skill. And punishments just don't do that. I mean, they're not designed to do that. It's not even like exactly a point I'm trying to make that's anything beyond technical, right? You don't learn how to make kimchi, for example, by being rewarded or punished. You learn by being, sort of shown how to do it and practicing that, getting feedback, practicing again, and so forth until you master it. Punishments will never do that. They just can't. It's just not what they're for. So these are the three big reasons that we really need to think about when it comes to punishments. And I promise you that in upcoming videos, I will be giving you ideas on alternatives for how to help kids with misbehaviors, because I promise you that I'm not going to be here and telling you, just sing Kumbaya and be nice and, just take the kids' misbehaviors. That's not the idea at all. And in fact, for folks who've seen me work with kids who are struggling with some big misbehaviors, I'm not necessarily known for sitting there sort of humming and hawing about it. I'm pretty firm and clear and can be sometimes perhaps a bit confrontational. But that being said, I really, really don't believe in punishments. So the 3 points again are punishments don't really produce behavioral change reliably, and they failed to do so in research as just sort of a general point. Number 2, punishments can have unintended consequences, like creating stress, resentment, and sometimes, frankly, stuff that's a little worse, but mostly a concern for kids who are already pretty fragile. And we can talk about that later. And the 3rd point is that punishments don't teach skills. And I've heard other child mental health professionals also make that point too. And it's a critical one. We don't learn skills by being punished or rewarded, really. Those things act as motivators, which is fine and can have a real value, motivation that is, but punishments don't teach skills. So thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video and got something out of it, feel free to click subscribe somewhere down there, I think, and, thumbs up me or something if you are so inclined. This is Dr. Brett Pearce, child psychologist, and I will see you in the next one.